Life in the medieval period looked like lots of different things to lots of different people. Your place in society could dictate everything, from what food you ate, where you could go, how educated you were, and even how long you were likely to live for. Across this series, we'll discover what life was like for those that worked, those that earned, those that learned, and those that played in medieval England.
Today we're here at Denny Abbey, which is a really exciting place to think about the various strands of medieval society. In the fields around the abbey, you would have peasants working. Peasants make up about 80% of the European population in the medieval period, and they are out in the fields growing the crops necessary for everybody to survive and for grand places like Denny Abbey to keep going. So if we're going to talk about peasants, what is a peasant? It doesn't just mean a poor person or someone who's lowly, which is kind of the way that we use it now. A peasant very specifically means a farmer. It's somebody who is tied to the land and they're out there farming. And it's the great majority of people in medieval Europe. 80% of the European medieval population as a whole are peasants. Underneath that, 70% of the European population are serfs, which means that they are peasants who are unfree or tied to the land. They live and work on strips of land that they rent from someone, a landlord, and they can't just decide that they want to move. They are seen as almost property in parcel with the land. So say a great lord or something inherits a manor, it's also assumed that they inherit the people that live on the manor as well. That sounds pretty bad, and to be honest, it is pretty bad. Being unfree isn't anybody's first choice. However, there are some rights that kind of go along with that as well. So you can't move down the road, but also your landlord can't kick you off your land. You are paying rent, but it is considered to be something that's in your family, and generations of serfs will pass the same land down through their family. So if serfs are tied to the land and they're paying rent to landlords, what is a landlord? The hint is kind of in the name. The lord is the pejorative here. So a lot of people who are landlords come from the nobility and noble houses. And we'll talk more about those later as well. But to be a landlord doesn't necessarily mean that one is a lord. Oftentimes, a landlord could be another peasant who is free and very well-to-do, or quite often, the church. On the one hand, medieval peasants in the countryside are all good Christians. So they're going to be happy that there are people in the abbey praying for their souls. On the other hand, they're the ones that pay for all of this. The abbey is also not doing their own farming. If you're spending all day long praying, or you're a retired monk like the Knights Templar, you're not going to be the one out in the fields plowing. It's the peasants who do the actual work that sustains the abbey. It's also interesting because since the abbey is enclosed, this is as close as any average medieval peasant would actually get to the abbey itself. You see this grand edifice that you're paying for, and you know that people are praying in it, but it's never something that you're going to be able to see from the inside. As we'll see, tensions like this eventually reach a boiling point. Peasants get really tired with their specific lot in life and the idea that they should simply be paying for everything around them with their own sweat. Farming in the medieval period is very interesting, I promise. This is because there are a lot of really big innovations that happen in the medieval period in terms of technology. Here is a really cool bit of medieval innovation. It's a causeway. What it is a raised bit of road that allows peasants to move their goods back and forth across the farmland here. As you can tell from all of the water behind me, here in the fens, it used to mostly be a bunch of marshes. A really neat medieval innovation is the draining of those marshes and turning them into arable land. It wasn't until the high medieval period that people actually knew how to do this. So previous to this, the entire fenland was really mostly unusable. When we talk about peasants and farming, and we're on historical farmland like this, it's really easy to forget that this isn't actually how things always looked for medieval farmers. What we see here is an example of what we call enclosed farming. When we see things like hedgerows and fences, that indicates that it's owned by one farmer who owns that land. That's not how farming works in the medieval period. The way that landlords kind of divvy out land for the various serfs and peasants that they oversee is generally through what we call the open field system. They've got 2 or 3 large fields, and then they might also have a common grazing ground for stuff like animals and livestock. They might also, if they're particularly well-to-do, have a couple of mill ponds so they can grind their own wheat into flour, and they might also have some fishing rights on those ponds as well. The way that land is then divided up further is through renting out the various strips of the fields into what are called sellions. So each family will have a certain number of sellions that they are responsible for tilling over time. And these will be passed down through generations in the same family, although they do pay rent to the landlord overall in order to farm them. Beyond draining fenlands and turning it into arable land, there's also a really cool medieval farming invention called the 3-field system. The 3-field system is when you alternate various strips of land and cultivate different things on it. So one year you might grow a crop that particularly strips a lot of nitrogen out of the soil. The next year you would then allow that same strip of land to go fallow and just take a bit of a break. Then the year after that, you would plant a crop, something like alfalfa, that puts a lot of nitrogen back into the soil. Then you can rotate in your crop that is going to pull a lot of nitrogen out again. This allows you to constantly be using land and constantly farming something without exhausting anything completely. This is important when you have really highly cultivated areas of land and a lot of people attempting to live off exactly the same parcels. So what are people farming? It really depends on the region that you're in. We know that they are farming wheat, barley, oats, rye, peas, and what are called vetches. Vetches are a kind of pea-adjacent crop that you kind of feed to horses and cattle and stuff like that. They're very important because they are one of those nitrogen-rich crops, which is going to enhance your soil after you've leached it out with a bunch of wheat. They're also raising livestock. So they're raising cattle, they're raising horses, they're raising pigs, all types of poultry. And excitingly, I promise, sheep. Luckily for medieval people, one of the best things that you can do with land that's been recently reclaimed is run sheep through it. Sheep are particularly important because they are covered in the miracle fiber that stays warm even when it's wet, wool. And wool is one of the most important and widely traded commodities in the medieval world. There are all sorts of trade routes which spring up specifically just to trade wool back and forth. What does this mean for peasants? Well, you can actually become pretty rich trading wool. This is especially true in England in the 14th century, when England, well, London more specifically, joins what's called the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League are a number of northern European towns, kind of along the North Sea and in the Baltic Sea, that trade wool and cloth back and forth. These are long international routes, and it's a good way to make very good money if you're a peasant. We do know that there are rich peasants, so they are not only getting by, but they're doing pretty well for themselves. And this might be through trading the actual vegetables, it might be through trading wool, or it might be engaging in other industries that are considered cottage, like brewing or weaving. And in fact, that's where we get the term cottage industry. It's something that someone might be doing in their cottage, unsurprisingly. So if you're growing a bunch of sheep, maybe you're also carding that wool and you're weaving it into cloth. Interestingly, both brewing and weaving are specific feminine industries. They were out there helping to till the land, certainly, but they might also be doing a second shift on top of that, making things like cloth and beer that can also be sold at market. This absolutely gorgeous medieval barn is a wonderful reminder of how important farm animals are in the medieval period. Because let's remember, this is owned by the abbey. So even monks and nuns are keeping their own cows, their own sheep, their own horses, and that's the sort of thing they could even do themselves. They don't necessarily need peasants to do it. If you want milk and butter, that isn't something you can get from the store in the medieval period. You've got to get it from a cow. It reminds us that all communities probably have their own farm animals in the countryside. So you have a really great and impressive barn like this to keep your animals inside, and to also keep crops like hay for the winter. Farm animals aren't just important because of the products that they can give you. Farm animals in their own right are a type of machinery in the medieval period. And they also change over time in terms of what the most popular animal to use for what is. In the earlier medieval period, we start to see the heavy plow come into use. It's a great new technology that allows you to slice through the heavier, more clay-based soils that we have in Northern Europe. The heavy plow, as the name indicates, is kind of heavy. So in order to pull one, you're going to use teams of oxen. The oxen will have what we call an ox collar over their neck. This allows them to pull the plow along with the human behind it guiding it through the fields. Later in the medieval period, however, we come up with the horse collar. A horse collar means that you can use horses to plow instead of oxen. Previous to the invention of the horse collar, we weren't exactly sure how to have a horse pull a plow without suffocating them. Horses, although they are not as strong as oxen, are much faster, so they can pull a plow faster through a field, and it actually speeds the work up. Horses are also really useful in their own right. You can use them for transportation. You can use oxen to pull carts, but because they tire more easily, it's better to use horses. So if you have a horse collar instead of an ox collar, it means that you can reduce the amount of livestock that you have for plowing, and the livestock that you have is a little more useful. Peasantry generally also has one hitch in that it's definitively tied to nature. You can't make wheat sprout in January, so you're always going to have to be doing things at a specific time of year that benefit that. It doesn't matter how hard you try, it's not going to be time to slaughter a pig in the middle of July. It just doesn't work that way. Another huge advantage that people in the medieval period have, at least in the high and late medieval period, is something that we call the medieval warm period. This spans from about the year 900 to about the year 1300, where Europe experiences a particularly warm and stable climate. So suddenly, winters are a little bit shorter, summers are a little bit longer, and you have a larger growing period for things. We see this reflected in stuff like what is called the labors of the year. It's a typical medieval art trope. And if you see pictures of December, for example, you'll see peasants engaging in their normal December activities, which are slaughtering pigs and baking bread. But there's no snow on the ground. In conjunction with the great medieval developments of the new tech, this means more food for more people and more happy peasants. These new technologies are very advanced, and it's the most advanced that Europe had ever been up to this point. Romans, for as much as they did do that is very interesting, couldn't come up with this. They did not have heavy plows, they did not have horse collars, and they did not have the three-field system. Suddenly, places like Germany or England can sustain much larger populations because they have peasants who are able to feed people using inventions like the horse collar, like the three-field system, and like the heavy plow. This is real tech, and it's a real advancement for society as a whole. We have one very interesting family, the Collinses, who are a great example of how peasants can really rise in the world. We first meet them through the means of Thomas Collins, the head of the family. He's a very well-to-do peasant. When we first meet him in the 1270s, we see that he owns half a virgate of land, which means about 15 acres or so. That's a lot of land. He also raises livestock like cattle and sheep, and some geese, which are a very nice little cash crop at Christmas or Michaelmas. Everybody likes to eat a goose. So he's doing extremely well, and we know also that his wife is brewing beer. So we know that there's a lot of money coming in for him, and he's definitely someone that you and I would class as well-to-do, if not simply middle class. All of this eventually changes, though, when we next catch up with him. There's a gap in the records from about 1282 to 1292, and when we see Thomas again, his fortunes have come down slightly. This was a man who was super well connected in his community. He was serving as a pledge. A pledge would mean that if someone else says, oh, I owe some money, Thomas would say, he's good for it and I will put my own land up. Thomas can't be a pledge anymore. Why? He's in debt. And he's in pretty serious debt. He comes to our attention through the court records because there's someone called Walter from Oldbury who sues Thomas because he owes him 5 shillings. Sounds probably like not much money, but for Thomas at the time, this is a real problem because he can't pay 5 shillings back. He's mortgaged all of his crops to someone else to pay off other debts. Mortgaging your crops is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's like mortgaging your house now. You'll say, okay, well, I've got my barley crop coming in the autumn, and so after I take that to market, you will get the proceeds from that barley if you give me money now. Walter is demanding his 5 shillings, Thomas can't pay it back, and Thomas is in a real dilemma here. It means that he has to sell one of the only things he possibly can, his land. But of course, Thomas doesn't own his land. He is a serf. Technically, the abbey owns his land, so the only person that he can sell his land to is the abbey. This is a really difficult circumstance to be in because obviously you can't demand, the best price possible. It's just whatever the abbey will give you. For the land that Thomas holds, the abbey gives him £2. Now, that definitely covers his debt to Walter, it covers his other debts, but it also means that the family are in real trouble now. There's 9 mouths to feed, and they're suddenly having to do so based only on Thomas's wife's land that she brought into the marriage through her dowry. This is interesting because it does show us that peasant women even do have some power and some control over their circumstances. Land that comes into a marriage is still their land, and Thomas's wife can't be forced to sell it if she needs to. They still need to make some money somehow, and the only real way to do that is if they can farm and take part in the generalized agricultural community that they live in. Unfortunately, it seems like that is not enough to ever get Thomas back to the same standing in the community that he enjoyed. He dies in the year 1312, and when he does, he's massively in debt again. His lands do pass to his wife and daughters, only 2 of whom have been married off, so you still got 6 women who need to be supported somehow. If we look for any records of them, by the year 1319, all of the Collins sisters are gone. We're not exactly sure what happened. It could be that all the Collins sisters simply moved away. That would be possible for them because they're women. They might be tied to the land, but the abbey is going to be less interested in forcing them to stay in place because they'll be seen as less productive peasants. If they need help tilling their crops, for example, why not just get some men in there to do it for them, people who don't have to ask for help? So it might be that they decide to try their luck somewhere else and simply moved away. Very unfortunately also, it's equally as possible that they simply all died. From the years 1317 to 1319, there was a continent-wide disaster called the Great Famine. As the name indicates, there simply wasn't enough food to go around. The Great Famine is a very serious event. It really does hurt the majority of the population in Europe, and we do see a huge drop in population at the time. The Collins sisters very well may have fallen victim to this. In the 1300s, we exit the medieval warm period. The temperature begins to drop, and Europe begins sliding into what we call the Little Ice Age. We can see again in medieval paintings like the Labors of the Year, suddenly we have December scenes of peasants slaughtering pigs in the snow instead of in the mud. So it means that we do know that the winters are colder and longer. But also there's been 2 years of extensively heavy rains and flooding. The crops simply can't grow. So there's a large mortality across the continent because there just isn't enough food to go around. This impacts peasants more than it impacts other layers of society. Say you're the local abbey. Their risk is sort of spread out over all of the peasants that they oversee. Those peasants still have to pay them their rent, they still have to pay them their crops. So they're getting fewer crops in, but it's still some of everybody's crops instead of being completely dependent on one specific patch of land. So when we think about peasants, we think of them as largely agrarian and in the countryside. For a good reason, you sort of have to do your farming in the countryside. However, that doesn't mean that they don't have any links to London itself. Just behind me, the Clothfair Street opens up onto the Smithfield. In the medieval period, this might actually have been referred to as the Smooth Field, and it's where peasants would bring their cattle, sheep, pigs in order to be slaughtered and sold at market. From the peasant's perspective, Smithfield is also an extraordinarily important place because it's the scene of one of the most important parts of the Peasants' Rebellion. The Peasants' Rebellion in England is part of a series of peasants' rebellions that we see in the 14th century across the continent. Here in England, it's led by a man named Wat Tyler. Wat Tyler is a peasant himself, but he's someone who thinks that he sees a world where peasants can take greater control. He's one of the first people that really starts arguing that there are generalized rights of men as a whole, and that peasants are more than just a sort of implement to till your land. They're people who deserve the same rights as we do. Also attached to Wat Tyler's rebellion is a man called John Ball. He's a popular preacher. There's a very famous quote often attributed to John Ball that we think might be spurious, which is, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then a gentleman?" This idea is that Adam and Eve were not noble, everyone has the same rights in God's eyes, so why is it that peasants have such a much more difficult shape in society? The peasants get together and they have an actual military rebellion. They famously come to London and besiege it. And they do really well, surprisingly. They take over London, they burn down the Savoy Palace, which is in the place of the Savoy here. Instead of looting all the goods from the Savoy Palace, though, they burn them all. They're not here to steal, they want to start a new society where everyone is on equal footing. They then come and meet up with the Lord Mayor of London on the Smithfield, led by their leader, Wat Tyler. Here, it's unclear exactly what happens, but some kind of scuffle breaks out and Wat Tyler is stabbed. He ends up dying. This is a huge blow to the Peasants' Rebellion because without a leader, they become much more fractious. There's no one really driving them forward with a real vision at this point in time. Eventually, the peasants are completely broken. King Richard II gives a very famous speech where he tells the peasants that they are rustics and rustics they will remain. He wants to make a point that peasants simply cannot see themselves as on equal footing with nobles or indeed himself, the king. They exist in order to give the nobility goods, and they have to know their place as rusticated. Here on the side of Smithfield Market, we finally have a memorial to the Peasants' Rebellion. I say now because it wasn't until 2015 that we had anything at all memorializing the Peasants' Revolt. This is despite the fact that the Peasants' Rebellion was something that affected the largest number of people in the 14th century at the time. I know I keep saying this, but it's 80% of the European population that are peasants. So the Peasants' Rebellion is one of the most important things in the lives of average people in England in the 14th century. Despite this, we still don't tend to treat peasants as though they're worthy of remembrance or important enough for it. All of this is particularly interesting because one of the things that we see after the years of famine, after the years of Black Death, is that within society, peasants live in a much more marginal position in the medieval period. And this is how medieval society likes it. Nobles simply don't want to give up their very privileged position in society, nor does the church. The church can't have hundreds of monks copying away in scriptoria if they can't be fed. Nobles can't spend all of their day learning how to sword fight if they have to be tilling fields. They depend on a certain class of person not having any choice in the matter. One of the frustrating things when we're trying to uncover the history of peasants in the medieval period is it's so difficult to find it. If they're 80% of the population, why is it that I have to come to a nunnery in order to find a barn? Their lands change hands all the time. And in fact, a lot of the time, their lands aren't their lands. So if you build a building, it's not necessarily going to be handed down through generations to come in your family. It might get taken over by someone like an abbey. Here at abbeys, we can uncover what it might be like for peasants more directly because they are held in the hands of the incredibly rich. Interestingly, here at Denny Abbey, one of the reasons why we have this great old barn is because after the dissolution of the monasteries, this is actually handed back over to farmers. Buildings like this are huge, monumental, and really important. So you wouldn't tear something like this down, especially not if you're an industrious farmer trying to make their way in the world. You'll take a huge barn like this if it's handed to you. It can be frustrating for us as historians or people who want to know more about medieval lives that we don't get to hear directly from peasants, that they are kind of considered not important enough to conserve their history. So it's our job to uncover the evidence of their tech, their lives, and their buildings where we can find it. That's why it's important to come to places like Denny Abbey to remember the people whose stories we don't hear from.
Join me in the next chapter as we visit the Grocers' Company Hall and discover what life was like for those in the guilds. Life in the medieval period looked like lots of different things to lots of different people. Your place in society could dictate everything, from what food you ate, where you could go, how educated you were, and even how long you were likely to live for. Across this series, we'll discover what life was like for those that worked, those that earned, those that learned, and those that played in medieval England.
When we talk about the 3 estates in the medieval period, those who work are often thought of as peasants, and this is quite right. because 80% of the European population, of course, are peasants, and that's what work means. However, there's also a number of workers who belong to one of the most powerful and influential groups in medieval Europe. These are the guilds. A guild is a really interesting institution because it's sort of halfway between what we would call a union now and halfway just a sort of monopoly. Guilds exist to say that someone can or cannot partake in a particular industry. You might be a fishmonger, you might be a leather maker, you might be a goldsmith. All of these, particularly in London, would require guild membership in order to take part of them. That you can't just decide that you're going to move to London and start selling fish. It's something that's protected very heavily in order to make sure that benefits go to people who are in a guild. Guilds exist across Europe, and they also exist across England. So in any of the big fancy medieval cities like York or Norwich, you'll also find guilds. We're here in the Grocers' Hall to talk about the second most important guild in London in the 14th century. That is the grocers. As the name indicates, they sell things in gross. Well, what does that mean? Specifically, when we're talking about the grocers, we're not talking about groceries in the way that we think now. We're talking about spices. Spices in the medieval period, and indeed into the early modern period, are one of the most expensive and important commodities in Europe. So the grocers are able to command prestige and power, as befits someone with a hall like this, because they're bringing in absolutely tons of money to the City of London. The term grocers for the medieval mind is such a particularized and important thing because spices occupy such an important part of both the economy and the medieval imagination. There are now about 110 guilds in London, though that was not true of the medieval period. And oftentimes when we talk about the medieval guilds, we're talking about what we call the Great 12. And they have a specific order because guilds love to rank themselves. So they are mercers, grocers, drapers, fishmongers, the goldsmiths, skinners, merchant tailors. That all depends on what year you ask that in, because they trade off every other year. Both of the guilds were incorporated in the year 1327, and we don't know who was incorporated first. 8. The haberdashers, then the salters, then the ironmongers, then the vintners, and then the clothworkers. All of these people have associations overseeing their particular trade and making sure only some people can come in and out. Beyond trade, these are also massively politically important people. In order to be a part of a guild, you also have to agree to be a city alderman, which means that you are one of the people who votes for and can become the Lord Mayor. The fact that London has a mayor is really interesting in and of itself, and it's specifically tied to the power and prestige of guilds. They are seen as so rich and influential that they need to have a say in royal matters. So the Mayor of London speaks for London in general, but what that means is that he's actually speaking for the guilds in front of the king and on par with members of the nobility. The Grocers Guild specifically, up until the year 1345, had already contributed 10 mayors of the City of London. This is just a little taste of exactly where power presides in the city. As you can see from the opulence of rooms like this, the guilds have a lot of money and power within London. This isn't just because they control specific trades, but because they actually own a lot of the property in London itself. If you're inside the city wall of London, you're in London. If you're outside of it, you're not. So property can't expand in London in the same way that it can now, because what constitutes London property has to be within the walls. It's easy for the guilds to monopolize all of that land. If you think London property is expensive now, in the medieval period where you simply couldn't make any more of it, it was even more important. This is one of the ways that the guilds are able to collectivize their power and prestige in London. So being a member of the guild has very specific political advantages in that you actually get some say in the world around you. It also has some personal advantages that knock on from that. So every member of a guild is also a freeman of the City of London. It's a way of disassociating people who are in guilds from ordinary workers like peasants. You are, well, a free man. You are not a serf. You're not owned by anyone or anyone's property. If you're a freeman, you're an alderman, you're a member of the guild. You're part of an elite society, although you may still work. There are also some knock-on advantages of that, in that you can drive sheep across London Bridge. That might sound kind of silly and weird, but what it means is that you can actually bring sheep to market without having to pay a tax on it, for example. Any peasants from the countryside who want to sell sheep for slaughter at Smithfield Market, or who want to sell on their wool, will have to pay a tax when they bring their sheep across London Bridge. If you're a freeman, no such fee applies to you. So it's ways like these that freemen can make more and more money, more and more easily, than their compatriots who might be unfree. For the most part now, the Grocers Guild is a charitable and social organization where you can come have a really amazing banquet, obviously. But what I really love about this incredible place setting is all these hints to the medieval period and where this company was originally established. In particular, I'm obsessed with these camels. Because they are an association that sells spices, the camel is inextricably linked in the minds of medieval people with the grocers. For them, spices are something that come in over the Silk Road from the east. Maybe these spices are coming all the way from East Asia. We know that there are, for example, Indonesian spices in regular use in medieval Europe. Maybe they simply have come from the Near East. There's something that's come through Jerusalem, for example. Either way, when medieval people think about spices, they think about camels. And that's why it's an integral part of the Grocers Association symbols. You'll find it on their livery, you'll find it on this table, you'll find it on the carpet in this room. And always you'll see that the camels are set up to be coming from the east. So here is where we would have the chairman of the table sit, and all of the camels look as though they're coming from the east from that perspective. I really love this bit of the medieval imagination persevering into the modern period. And also they're just really cute. Here on the table, we also have some nice hints about what the organization used to do. We have this lovely gavel to call any proceedings to order. And over here, we have the seal from the barge. Why would a guild have a barge? Well, in the medieval period, there's only one bridge in and out of the city, London Bridge. And it's actually somewhere where people live as well. It's much, much smaller than it is now, so it could take forever to get back and forth across to Southwark. An important company like the Grocers would have their own barge, so any members can get back and forth across the river very quickly and in some style. This ornate door of the Grocers Guild gives us a great opportunity to talk about the guild's crest itself. At the top, again, we see this camel coming in from the east, but what's quite interesting on the guild crest itself is the clove. Of course, it's a reference now to the spice clove. But in the 14th century, that's not what clove meant. Clove is actually a reference to the weights that were used by grocers to measure out spices as they were sold. So it's actually a nice little double entendre. It does remind us of the spices that are being sold by grocers, but it also tells you exactly how they did that. When you come into the Grocers Hall, one incredibly exciting thing they have is this, the oldest working bell in London. It initially comes from a nearby parish church, which is no longer extant. And on the bell is inscribed the words in Flemish, "My name is Martin, may my sound be God-pleasing, 1458. The guilds here would be working very closely and trading oftentimes with the continent itself. As a result, you have Flemish communities within London, and these are the sort of people that might be involved with the guilds. So, since this is the oldest working bell in London, let's give it a go. I mean, it's pleasing to me. Because the guilds are so incredibly rich and influential, we have a lot of records about them. And this is great because that means that we can know more about the individual lives of people who are involved in guilds. In particular today, we're going to talk about the Dartan family, who are mercers. This means they're general merchants, and the mercers are considered the first and most important guild in the city of London. We know that the Dartans lived on a particular street called Soppers Lane, which unfortunately no longer exists. It was burnt down during the Great Fire of London in 1666. This little courtyard is near the site of where Soppers Lane would have been in the medieval period. As you can see from the sign behind me, this is where St. Pancras Church was. And we know that was the Dartan family parish church. This church served the pastoral needs of the pepperers and mercers who lived on Soppers Lane. This is indicative of how the communities of mercers and grocers worked. They lived in the same area because they were involved in slightly similar trades, and they also set up shop with their specific guilds as close as they could to their own community. It's these mercers and these grocers, these few families, that really control both this neighborhood and trade in the city. This is the actual Mercer's Hall, and it's interesting because it's just across the street from where Soppers Lane would have been. So the Dartan family would have had a very, very easy commute, if you like, between their own home and the Mercer's Hall itself. However, whilst the community of mercers is very close to the hall itself, that isn't where they go about their day-to-day business. In the medieval period, the majority of actual business dealings will take place within a family's own house and household. They have their own offices there, they probably have their own store. That's the sort of place where you see day-to-day business taking place. The Mercer's Hall is for conducting any guild-specific business and enjoying a banquet now and then. Walking just a few more minutes away from Soppers Lane in the Mercer's Hall, we then encounter this, the Goldsmiths' Hall. It's a reminder of how dense the number of guilds in the City of London are. You can't make it more than a few streets without running into another one. We are here back outside St. Bart's, which, if you've seen my other program about walking around communities of medieval London, you might remember. But today I'm not going to talk about St. Bart's again, as exciting as I think it is. I'm here to talk about 41 Cloth Fair just behind me. It is the oldest house still extant in the City of London, and it dates to the 16th century. That's a little bit later than we are talking about for the majority of this program, but it tells us something very interesting about houses in London generally. A household will mean the family itself, like the de Garteners, but it'll also mean the various servants that work for them, and it will also, and very crucially, mean their apprentices, people who are living with them, kind of as indentured servants, learning a particular trade that they want. We know that the Dartan family brings in apprentices specifically from Lincolnshire quite often to learn how to be a mercer. So a household is also not always just one house. It might be a series of houses that are around an enclosed courtyard in the middle of town. 41 Cloth Fair is just such a place. It used to be a collection of 11 buildings around a centralized courtyard just over here. And it lets us think about a different kind of city. It's not just individual buildings and individual people. It's part of a collective of which guilds help to make. The de Gartens are one such really influential and rich house. We know that they have servants. We know that they have apprentices. Why do you have apprentices? If you want to get into a guild, there are only 4 specific ways of doing so. If you're lucky enough to be born a de Garten, that's the #1 way to get into a guild, just through patrimony. If your father is a mercer, then you can be a mercer if you're a man. It's just that easy. The second most common way is to be an apprentice. That means that you go and live and work, often for free, in a household, learn the trade. The family therefore gets the benefit of your work and their help, and then you can set up once you pass a mastership and you can be a member of the guild itself. The third way that you can join a guild is what's called redemption. Redemption is interesting because it sounds like it's probably a punishment, and it's kind of shown to be like that, and it's framed in that way. But it actually just means you're buying your way in. You have to buy a fee to sort of redeem yourself for not having the privilege of being born into a guild family or not having worked your way up. So if you've got enough spare cash, you can become a mercer, provided that the mercers want your money. That's redemption. The fourth way is through invitation, and that is really uncommon. When we say that someone can join a guild through invitation and that it's a rare honor, who is it who is invited into a guild? Well, here we have a great modern example of that in the Grocers Guild, when we see on the table King George III's domed tanker. And granted, that is a modern example, but it shows you just what prestige a guild has, even into the modern period. The kinds of invitations that are given out to monarchs, the ruling classes, really important people who make huge decisions about the country. Even if you are King George III, you want to come hang out with the Grocers Guild. You might have noticed when I'm talking about guilds here that I keep saying free men. And that's because in order to join a guild, you have to be a man. This is annoying because it's not as though women aren't participating in the same work as men in guilds. And often it's super common for members of guilds to intermarry. There are huge advantages to marrying a woman from another guild family because she knows how to conduct the business of the guild that you're in. And it's often specifically women who look after the books of their husbands' businesses. Another specific political function that members of guilds has is they're often elected to act as the Sheriff of London. There's no such thing as a police force for medieval people. What there is a posse comitatus. A posse comitatus gets called together by a sheriff when a crime is committed. So say you're the sheriff and you know that someone was robbed down the street and you want to find who did it. It will be your job to call together a bunch of men to go look for the thief. We know that the Dartans serve as sheriff on several occasions, which is a great indication of how powerful they are within their own community. There's a lot of guild members in the city, but there aren't always a lot of sheriffs. So getting up to that high level shows that you really know people and you're very well thought of. Hugh de Carton is one such person. He's elected Sheriff of London in 1314. He also acts, interestingly, as a witness in a murder case in 1324. Someone was just murdered in the middle of Soppers Lane, and he was called on to act as a witness and tell everybody what happened. A terrible scene, but something that does happen from time to time. All of this is very interesting because Hugh de Carton also is a bit of a chancer. Even though Hugh himself acts as sheriff and he's considered to be an upstanding member of the community, he himself at a point in time joins a gang and robs a neighbor for 200 pounds of cash. This is an absolutely unbelievable sum of money. If we think back to our episode about peasants and we think about poor Thomas Collins who had to sell off his 15 acres of land, he gets 2 quid for it. This is 100 times that amount of money. This shows us a lot about life in London because, number one, people in guilds have this kind of cash just hanging out. That's the equivalent of keeping hundreds of thousands of pounds in your house now. And apparently they do. But it's also really interesting because say you were going to steal hundreds of thousands of pounds now, you would expect that you would get in some serious trouble for that. Hugh de Carton emphatically does not. He's let completely off the hook. Why and how? The king. Hugh de Carton has so much power and prestige that he's well known to the king, can throw himself on his mercy, and be completely let off for committing a huge and heinous crime. To be very clear, say Thomas Collins, who was in extreme debt, went and stole, I don't know, 5 pounds from someone. He would almost certainly be killed for that. However, Hugh de Carton can be accused of a much, much worse crime and absolutely nothing is done to him as a result. He is so wealthy and well-connected that he does specific services for the king. On several occasions, he acts as a messenger for the king, ferrying various letters and money throughout the kingdom. The king is not going to be sending money up and down the country with just anyone. It needs to be someone who can be relied upon. And apparently that reliance goes far enough that you're allowed to steal a cheeky fortune here and there. We're here outside the Wax Chandlers Guild, who are a great representation of what it is that guilds did in the City of London. They supply the goods and services that people in London need. Let's keep in mind this is a world before electricity, so candles are an extraordinarily important commodity. It's the wax chandlers who provide that and have the monopoly on services for it within the City of London. Fun unicorn fact, I also love this because it's a great example of the medieval idea of a unicorn. Now when we think about unicorns, we think of them as horses with horns, but they're not. They're actually monsters. They're half lion, half goat, and they're savage. So if you look at these ones up here, you can see that they are goats because they have cloven hooves. They don't have a mane so much as a little bit of a beard and what's left over from a lion's mane, not a horse's. Members of guilds are not living their lives on the same razor's edge that peasants are. Their money is not so specifically tied to the land. You can stockpile wool, You can stockpile spices. You can continue to sell things that people want, even if a harvest is failing. That insulates you from a lot of the more difficult things that peasants have to experience in the medieval period. We're talking about the Dartan family, who are fabulously wealthy and enjoying an incredibly privileged life at the same time that the Great Famine is happening in the rest of Europe. The Collins family, the peasant family we talked about before, completely dies out at this point and we lose track of them. In contrast, the Dartan family becomes only more wealthy and more well-connected. There are all sorts of people in the city, just as there are now, who are doing day-to-day things like running restaurants, working at the markets, acting as bakers, and they're not going to be members of guilds. Probably though they are interconnected with guilds because odds are they're renting from a member of a guild. But they're not enjoying the same kind of rarefied life that guild members are. Standing in a place like this, it's really easy to forget that working is not always something that is associated with great wealth and power in the medieval period. It just so happens that we know a lot about the people that is true for. It's a good reminder that while a lot of the work that is happening in the medieval period, and indeed the majority, is work done by peasants in the countryside, there are still a huge group of people who are trading, who are working, and are politically important, who are involved in the Third Estate. Guild members are some of the most important, wealthy, and well-connected people in the medieval world. They are also very much seen as sort of denizens of cities. When we talk about peasants, we're talking about the story of life in the countryside, and we're talking about the story of most people. When we talk about guild members, we're talking about the story of cities themselves. The difference between guild members and the other people working in cities is also often linked to the fact that we just don't have records of them. I want to talk to you about people who are working in cities, so I'm talking to you about guild members because I can find them. I can find the Dartan family. I can know all about them. I can know who they married, where they live, and what they get up to in their spare time, which is robbing, apparently. I can't tell you that much about the local bakers. I can't tell you that much about the people who are actually physically selling fish in the street, as opposed to people who are part of the fishmongers' guild. This is a really sad state of affairs. I love to know more about common people, and I would love to tell you all about whoever is driving swine down Sopper's Lane. Unfortunately, I can only really tell you who is written about, and the people that we tend to write about are the people who are well-connected and wealthy because they can do things like ask favors from the king. But there's also a really interesting group of people in cities who aren't working. They're praying, and that's the clergy, who we'll talk about next.